Okay, think about this for a second. Chess. It's ancient, right? Deeply studied. And yet those very first moves, wow, the possibilities just explode. It's kind of mind-bending.
It really is. How do players even start to grapple with that, comparing all those opening sequences?
Exactly. It feels almost impossible. But that's what we're diving into today. You shared some fantastic sources with us, an academic paper, a method for comparing chess openings from Archive, and bits from John Watson's classic Mastering the Chess Openings.
Right. And our mission really is to unpack how these openings are compared, what the core ideas are behind them. We want to find some of that surprising logic hiding in those first few moves.
And hopefully give you, our listener, a way to think about openings without just drowning in endless variations. We're aiming for the key principles, the strategic stuff that pops up in these texts. Maybe spark a few aha moments about the start of a chess game.
Exactly. Focusing on the framework, the bigger picture.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What is a chess opening, technically speaking? Seems simple, but the sources are pretty specific.
They are. Watson really stresses this. An opening isn't just, the first few moves you happen to play. It's a precisely defined sequence.
Like, give us an example.
Sure. The English opening is just 1 c4. That is the opening definition. Or the Sicilian defense. 1 e4 c5.
Okay.
And even complex variations have a definite endpoint. Like the Najdorf Sicilian. 1 e4 c5 2. nf3 d6 3. d4 cx d4 4. annex d4 nf6 5. nc3 a6. That sequence is the Najdorf. It stops there, definitionally.
So it's not just a general vibe for the first, say, 10 moves. It's specific sequences with clear names and endpoints.
Precisely. Although sometimes people use opening more loosely to talk about a family of similar positions. For proper analysis, especially comparing them, that strict definition is really important.
Makes sense. So, okay, the opening moves are made, the sequence is defined. What are players actually trying to do in these first stages? What are the fundamental goals?
Well, the sources hammer home a few key things. First and foremost, control the center. Those central squares are critical.
Why the center specifically?
Because pieces placed in the center control more of the board. They have more options, more influence. Ideally, you want pawns there, supported by pieces.
And when we say center, we mean?
Usually the d4, e4, d5, e5 squares. The sources talk about center pawns being on the D&E files between ranks 2 and 7. They mention an ideal center, like white pawns on d4 and e5, really dominating. Or maybe a broad center, like black having pawns on c5, d5, e5, and f5. It's about staking your claim early.
Okay, center control. Got it. What else is fundamental?
Efficient development, getting your pieces, knights and bishops, especially off the back rank and onto useful squares, quickly but effectively.
Useful squares being key, right?
Right.
Not just moving them anywhere.
Exactly. The goal is usually to move each piece just once, maybe twice in the opening, to get it actively involved. Don't waste time shuffling pieces around aimlessly.
Now, I always hear you shouldn't bring your queen out too early. Why is that such common advice?
Yeah. Because the queen is so powerful, she immediately becomes the target if she comes out too soon.
A target for what?
For the opponents developing minor pieces, their knights and bishops. They can attack your queen, forcing her to move again while they develop their pieces and gain time. It's called losing tempo.
Right, so your opponent gets their pieces out while you're busy saving your queen. Makes sense. What about pawns? They seem less glamorous than pieces, but the sources stress their importance.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Pawn structure is huge. Pawns sort of define the terrain of the battle.
How so?
Well, they create weaknesses, sure, but they also control key squares, block lines, or open them up for your pieces. They determine which squares are strong outposts, which files might open for your rooks, which diagonals for your bishops. In many ways, the pawn structure comes first, strategically.
Wow, okay, so the pawns are like the architects of the position.
That's a great way to put it. And the thinking on when to move pawns versus pieces has shifted. It used to be more pawns before pieces, but now it's much more nuanced, more about balancing pawn moves that support your plan with getting your pieces developed harmoniously.
Interesting evolution.
Yeah.
And what about black? They move second. What's their typical opening goal? Just survive.
Traditionally, yes, the main goal was seen as achieving equality, neutralizing white's first move advantage. Get to a level position.
No.
But, as Watson points out, many modern openings are much more ambitious for black. They aim to create imbalances, fight for the initiative right away, not just equalize. So equality is still a baseline, but aggressive play is definitely on the table for black in many lines.
Okay, cool. So we have center control, development, queen safety, pawn structure, black aiming for equality or more. Let's build on that. What are some bigger strategic concepts that emerge during the opening?
Good question. One big one is space advantage. Simply controlling more squares on the board.
More territory.
Exactly. Once pieces start getting developed, who has more room to maneuver becomes really important. The king's Indian defense is a classic example. Black often fights for kingside space, white for queenside space. It's about where your pieces can operate most freely.
So it's not just development, but where you develop and how much board you control.
Precisely. Then there's king safety, obviously important. Usually you castle your king behind some pawns.
Usually.
Right. But pawn cover isn't everything. The sources mention a famous game, Laskerbauer, where white just threw pieces at the black king, and even though black had pawns there, the sheer attacking force overwhelmed the defenses. Active threats can trump passive safety.
That's a powerful reminder. What other strategic ideas come up often?
The bishop pair. Having both your bishops is generally seen as a long-term advantage.
Why is that?
Because together they can control squares of both colors, light and dark. Especially powerful in open positions with clear diagonals.
But there are exceptions.
Oh, sure. If the bishops are hemmed in by pawns, or if the opponent's knights have really strong posts they can't be easily dislodged from, the advantage might disappear or even reverse. It's about how active the bishops are.
Okay, activity over just having them. Makes sense.
Yeah.
What about pawn chains?
Right, those linked lines of pawns. A key idea is how to attack them. You can attack the pawn furthest back, or the head the pawn furthest forward.
How does that play out?
Well, in the Slav defense, sometimes white gets a pawn chain, and black might try to break it up by attacking the base with a move like point e5. In the Sicilian, you often see clashes where both sides are trying to advance pawns to attack the opponent's pawn chain, like black playing dot f5 or point b5, and white playing f4 or b4.
So understanding pawn chains tells you where the pressure points are.
Yes.
Doubled pawns. Good or bad?
It's ambiguous, very context dependent. Doubled pawns happen when you capture, say, on c6 with the b pawn, ending up with two pawns on the c file. They can be weak because they can't defend each other easily and one might block the other. But they can also control important central squares or help open a file for a rook. The two knights' defense is an opening where they often crop up, and whether they're good or bad depends entirely on the specific position.
So it depends situation in chess.
Very much so.
Oh.
Then there's the isolated queen's pawn, the IQP.
What's that?
That's a pawn on the d file, usually d4 or d5, with no friendly pawns on the files next to it. The c file and e file.
And that's also ambiguous.
Double-edged is the classic term. It can be a weakness because it can't be defended by other pawns, and the square in front of it, d5 usually, becomes a great outpost for the opponent, often for a knight to blockade it.
But the upside?
The upside is that the owner of the IQP often gets open lines for their pieces, open E and C files for rooks, open diagonals. It often leads to very dynamic attacking play.
Interesting trade-off. Weak pawn, active pieces.
Exactly, and related to all this pawn stuff is the idea of pawn majorities. Having more pawns on one side of the board, king side or queen side, than your opponent.
Why does that matter?
It's especially important later in the game. If you have, say, 4 pawns against 3 on the queen side, you can often force one of them through to become a passed pawn, which is a huge advantage.
Aiming for promotion.
Right. And you also see the opposite idea, the minority attack. That's where you use your fewer pawns on one wing, maybe push your B pawn against their C pawn to try and break up their pawn majority and create weaknesses. And then there are specific structures, like the Carlsbad with its particular pawn setup, leading to known plans.
It really sounds like these pawn structures are the bedrock strategy.
They absolutely are. They define the long-term plans for both sides in many, many openings.
This is great for understanding the why behind opening moves. Can we maybe look at a few specific openings mentioned in the sources and see how these ideas work in practice?
Definitely. Let's start with the open games one, e4, e5. Watson says these often lead to wide open positions, lots of tactics, early clashes.
Like the King's Gambit.
Exactly. 1, e4, e5, 2, f4. White sacrifices a pawn immediately for quick development and an attack. Very sharp. Or the Gioco Piano 1, e4, e5, 2, nf3, nc6, 3, bc4, which is usually a bit quieter, more about maneuvering early on.
Okay, so e4, e5 often leads to fireworks. What if black doesn't play 1 point e5?
Then we're in the semi-open games. Here, black's first move typically challenges white's e4 pawn right away, but not symmetrically.
The most famous being?
The Sicilian defense, 1 e4 c5, hugely popular, incredibly complex. Then you have the French defense, 1 e4 e6, and the Caro-Kann defense, 1 e4 c6. All try to fight white's center differently.
Let's touch on the Sicilian. So many variations. Can we see some of our concepts in a couple of them?
Sure. Take the Nachdorf, 1 e4 c5 2. nf3 d6-3, d4 sieg d4-4, nxd4 nf6-5, nc3 a6. That little pint a6 move often signals black wants queenside space, maybe pushing the b-pawn. White often replies very directly against the king, maybe it was 6, bg5, or 7f4. So a fight between queenside expansion and kingside attack.
Okay, clear strategic clash. What about the dragon variation?
That's 1, e4 c5-2, nf3 d6-3, d4 c d4-4, or nxd4 nf6-5, nc3 g6. Black puts the bishop on g7, the fianchetto. It eyes the long diagonal. White's most famous reply is the Yugoslav attack, often involving castling queenside and launching a pawn storm against black's king. So king's safety becomes incredibly critical, a very sharp play.
Wow, yeah, very different feel just from changing 1 or 2 moves early on. What about the Caro-Kann, 1e4 c6?
The Caro-Kann usually reached after 1.c62. d4, d5 is known for being very solid. Black gets a strong central pawn structure.
What happens next, typically?
Well, white has choices. The exchange variation, 3x d5, leads to symmetrical pawns, often quieter positions. The advance variation, 3e5, grabs space but gives black targets to counterattack. And the Panov attack, after 3x d5, cid5-4, c4, often leads to, guess what?
Uh-oh, an isolated queen's pawn.
You got it. Often for black in that line. So again, dynamic play, weakness versus activity.
It's amazing how these structures keep reappearing. We have to mention the Ruy Lopez, right? 1,
Yeah.
e4, e5, 2, nf3, nc6, 3, bb5.
Oh, absolutely. The Spanish game. One of the oldest, most analyzed openings. White puts immediate pressure on black's knight, controlling the e5 pawn.
And black has tons of ways to respond.
Tons. Our sources mention things like the Chigorin defense, 3n a5, which is quite aggressive, counterattacking immediately, or the super solid Breyer defense, which involves a long sequence starting 3.a64, bath4 nf65, OO-b7, and later retreating the knight with nb8. Very positional maneuvering. Then there's the Zaitsev variation, another long, highly theoretical line known for deep strategic complexity.
It sounds like the Ruy Lopez is a whole world in itself.
It really is. Deep strategy, subtle maneuvering, it has everything.
The sources also briefly mention the Philidor and the 2 knights.
Right. The Philidor defense, 1 e4 e5 2, nf3 d6 is solid for black, but can be a bit passive, giving white space. The 2 knights defense, 1 e4 e5 2, nf3 nc6 3, bc4 nf6 is much sharper. Black immediately counterattacks white's e4 pawn, leading to tactical lines, especially if white plays 4, and g5, heading for f7.
Okay, this has been fantastic, really clarifying the ideas behind the move. So pulling it all together, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive?
I think the main thing is that openings aren't just about memorizing moves. They're deeply rooted in fundamental chess principles: center control, efficient development, king safety, and critically understanding pawn structures. Your opening choice really sets the strategic tone for the whole game.
And was there anything particularly surprising or insightful that jumped out from the sources?
For me, it's how this seemingly infinite variety of openings often boils down to a surprisingly small number of recurring strategic themes and pawn structures. You see similar ideas, similar fights popping up in different openings, and even with centuries of analysis, people are still finding new ideas in these old lines. Chess is just incredibly deep.
So why should you, our listener, care about all this? How does it help?
Because understanding these core concepts gives you a compass. Even if you don't know the exact book line, recognizing the pawn structure, understanding the fight for space, knowing the typical plans associated with, say, an IQP or the bishop pair that helps you make good strategic decisions on your own, it builds intuition and confidence.
Right, it's about understanding the why, not just the what.
Exactly.
Okay, finally, something to leave you thinking about. Consider this. That initial architecture set up by the pawns and pieces in the opening, how it casts such a long shadow over the entire game, often shaping the middle game battles and even the end game possibilities. So maybe ask yourself, what kinds of architectural principles apply elsewhere? In other strategic decisions you make in life, how much does that initial setup influence everything that follows?